It was a heavy summer night in 1881 when fate quietly began weaving the story that would haunt the quiet fields of Missouri for generations. Howard County, like so many rural communities of the time, lived from the soil and the rhythms of the harvest. Men labored from sunrise to dusk, while women kept homes intact, raised their children, and carried the silent weight of survival in a world where faith was often the only comfort. Life appeared simple, but beneath the surface of predictable routines lay secrets, anxieties, and fears that shaped the imagination of everyone who lived there. Into this world was born Clara Holloway, a girl with light brown hair, uncommon green eyes, and a temperament that seemed older than her years. She was the only child of Samuel Holloway, a modest farmer, and Margaret, a devout woman whose faith in Scripture softened the hardships of rural life. From her earliest years, Clara was not like the other children. While others hollered and played barefoot in the dusty lanes, Clara often stood apart. She had a stillness about her, a gaze that fixed itself on horizons as if she were waiting for something distant and inevitable. Neighbors noted her quiet nature, with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. She was too watchful, too serious, like someone carrying a secret too heavy for such a young child. As the narrator recounts, there were whispers even then, tiny remarks about the Holloway's daughter being different. Some neighbors dismissed it as childish imagination, but others felt a strange unease. Clara asked questions no child should have reason to raise. She once asked her mother, "Mama, how do we know when our time has come?" Margaret, startled, resisted the chill that the words sent through her. She would respond with something drawn from her Bible, perhaps citing that only God could decide such things. But Clara's gaze, unblinking, always seemed dissatisfied. She was not asking for biblical comfort. She seemed to want something more definite, something even adults could not answer. By the time Clara turned 7, a troubling pattern began to form. She repeated a phrase that shook those who heard it. "My life will end soon," like the sun that sets before the harvest. She would whisper it at unexpected moments, sometimes to her weary mother at night, sometimes to neighborhood children during play. Those children, frightened, would run home in tears, leaving their parents to wonder aloud what kind of thoughts lived in the Holloway child's mind. Samuel, pragmatic and hardened by farm life, always dismissed it. "She's a dreamer," he would say. Children say strange things and they forget them the next day, but Clara never forgot. The narrator emphasizes here, her words lingered, repeating with the calm certainty of someone speaking a truth already written. And that is what unsettled people, not the words themselves, but the way she said them, without hesitation, without fear. There are stories that in the small Holloway farm late in the evening, Clara would sit on the porch as the cicadas hummed their endless chorus. Samuel would smoke his pipe in silence, Margaret sewing by the lamplight. Then in that quiet, Clara would murmur softly, as if to herself, "Papa, when the leaves turn brown, I will be gone with them." Samuel would flinch but quickly conceal his unease, rebuking her sharply. "That's nonsense. Clara, don't talk like that again." But Margaret's hands would still her sewing frozen, and her eyes, though lowered, would glisten with a fear she dared not voice. Life in Howard County carried on. Neighbors worked their fields, church bells called the faithful each Sunday, and children found joy even in hardships. Yet in that normal world, Clara Holloway remained strangely apart, and the memory of her words would not fade as quickly as others hoped. The story of the girl who quietly spoke of her own end was already beginning to take root in whispers, planting the first seeds of a haunting tale. But for now the Holloways lived on, caught between denying their daughter's strange remarks and fearing what those words might mean. And as the summer of 1881 slowly turned toward autumn, the air itself seemed heavier, as if carrying with it the weight of things yet to come. The Holloway farm sat on a stretch of worn land, several miles from the small town center of Fayette, Missouri. The wooden house, modest and weathered, bore the marks of a simple life. Its porch creaked under Samuel's boots at dawn and dusk, its roof struggled against summer storms, and its walls carried the muffled sounds of prayers that Margaret whispered in the evenings. To neighbors, the Holloways were ordinary folk, neither affluent nor destitute, navigating survival as many did in the wake of the Civil War's lingering shadow. But Clara made them different, a difference that neighbors felt in silences, in glances exchanged over dinner tables, and in uneasy verses shared behind church pews. By 8 years old, Clara had grown taller, her features sharper, and the peculiarity of her behavior only deepened. While other children in Howard County clung to games of marbles or racing barefoot in the dusty fields, Clara's interests wandered elsewhere. She sought solitude by the corn rows, scribbling notes in a small journal Margaret had once bought her for school. Words filled the pages, uneven but thoughtful. The content, neighbors would later recall, was haunting. Samuel, noticing her bent over the little book one evening, asked, "What are you writing there, Clara? Is it sums or spelling words?" Clara looked up quietly, her green eyes reflective even in the dimming light. "No, Papa. I'm writing down the days I feel heavy, in case someone needs to know when I go." Samuel froze, his pipe halfway to his lips. He forced a hollow laugh. "That's foolish talk. No more of it, you hear?" And though his tone was gruff, his hand trembled slightly when he turned away. Margaret, listening from the doorway, pressed her hands together, whispering a silent prayer. Yet, though she was deeply unsettled, she could never bring herself to punish Clara. Instead, she would murmur, "Lord, keep this child safe." Let these words be nothing but shadows that pass. Stories truly began spreading during Clara's schooling. At the one-room schoolhouse, where children of all ages huddled under the instruction of stern Miss Abernathy, Clara often withdrew into silence. Some days she barely responded when questions came her way. Others, she startled her classmates with comments that hung heavy in the air. One autumn morning, as the wind rattled through brittle leaves and dust lifted across the dirt road, Miss Abernathy asked the children to write about what they wished to be when they grew up. Boys enthusiastically scribbled farmer, blacksmith, or soldier. Girls wrote about being seamstresses, schoolteachers, or wives. Clara, however, wrote a single line, "I will not live long enough to be anything." When Miss Abernathy read it, her face stiffened. She folded the small paper quickly, hiding her reaction, as other children giggled or whispered at Clara's strange entry. After class, she kept Clara behind. The teacher asked softly, "Clara, why would you write such a thing?" Clara's response was calm, almost detached. "Because it's true. I just know it. The earth already told me." Miss Abernathy, unnerved, sent a letter home to Margaret urging vigilance. When Margaret read the note, she wept silently at the kitchen table, too afraid to show Samuel. But children talk, and soon the words found their way through Fayette. Mothers whispered among themselves after Sunday service. The Holloway girl was odd, perhaps cursed, perhaps touched by illness of the mind. Fathers muttered in lowered tones that Samuel had better set her straight before she embarrassed them further. And Clara's classmates? They began to avoid her. The girl, once invited to share lunches beneath the oak tree, now sat alone. When children did approach, it was always with wary glances and cautious speech, as if any word might invite one of her unsettling phrases. One boy recalled later that Clara turned to him during recess and said, "Don't worry. Yours will be a long life, though it will carry much sorrow after the war that comes someday." Words lost in the moment, but remembered years later with a haunting weight. Within the Holloway home, tension grew. Samuel was a man of the earth, practical, slow to affection, yet unwavering in responsibility. To him, every problem had a solution: work harder, pray more earnestly, or discipline firmly. But with Clara, none of these tools seemed to work. "You indulge her too much, Margaret," he would mutter. A sharp hand could silence this nonsense. "She'll learn soon enough that life's not for foolish dreams." Margaret, however, was not so sure. She saw something in Clara's eyes that unsettled even her, a mixture of knowledge and frailty. One evening she asked quietly, "Clara, why do you speak of your end so often?" Clara looked down at her lap for a long moment before answering, "Because, Mama, it feels like a shadow that follows me. Some nights I see it closer than others. And when the fields turn gold, I feel it waiting." Margaret's hands trembled as she reached for her daughter, drawing her into a desperate embrace. She wanted to dismiss it, to call it the imagination of a sensitive child. Yet a part of her heart wrestled with the terrifying possibility that Clara's words might not be mere invention. Samuel refused to speak of it outside those walls, but the silence only deepened the fracture in their home. Clara continued with her strange statements, unshaken by anger or fear. By 1881, Missouri, faith and superstition still walked hand in hand. In Fayette, Any deviation from ordinary life stirred unease. Clara's words were no longer confined to her parents. They were becoming public knowledge. At church, sermons seemed charged with indirect glances toward the Holloways. Reverend Collins, known for his fiery sermons, once declared, "We must guard our hearts from false visions, lest the devil deceive us with illusions of fate." Margaret felt eyes on her pew that day, the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Samuel simply gritted his teeth, pretending not to notice. But Clara sat quietly, her green eyes steady, as if the Reverend's words had not been meant for her at all. Still, not everyone shunned her completely. A few women pitied Margaret, offering whispers of comfort that perhaps Clara was merely melancholy, a child too intelligent and sensitive for her own good. Yet others whispered far darker explanations, muttering about signs, curses, or punishment for sins unknown. The strange fate of Clara Holloway had, in truth, become a quiet obsession among Fayette's residents. People could not help themselves. They repeated the girl's words, even as they claimed not to believe them. The true turning point came in the late autumn of 1881. According to later accounts, Clara had been particularly quiet that week, her writings more frequent, her walks to the edge of the fields longer and longer. Margaret grew increasingly troubled, but was not sure how to stop her. One evening, as a fire cracked inside the Holloway home, and Samuel sat exhausted from a day's work, Clara approached her parents calmly. She stood at the edge of the lamplight and said softly, "When the first frost comes, don't be afraid. It will take me like it takes the flowers, but I am not afraid." Samuel slammed his fist onto the table. "That's the last of this, Clara," he roared. His voice shook, partly with anger, partly with fear he refused to admit. "You'll speak no more of death in this house." Margaret, eyes brimming with tears, looked at her daughter with silent dread. Clara, however, did not cry. She merely nodded, as if acknowledging her father's command, then added gently, "I love you, Mama, and I love you. Papa, I want you to remember that when the frost comes." Her words hung in the air, echoing long after the sound of Samuel's hand striking the table faded. The first frost of 1881 arrived earlier than anyone expected. Farmers in Howard County woke to find their fields glistening silver beneath the pale morning sun. Leaves had crisped overnight, their edges curling as though the air had carried knives instead of wind. Cattle stood still, their breath rising in white plumes, and neighbors gathering at the well remarked that Missouri hadn't seen a frost this sharp in years. Yet in the Holloway house, the frost meant more than ruined crops or shortened harvests. With every step across the brittle ground, Samuel and Margaret felt haunted by the echo of their daughter's words. "When the first frost comes, don't be afraid. It will take me like the flowers." Clara had not faltered. She moved through the days with the same gentle calm, neither frightened nor excited, simply expectant. To Samuel, this infuriated more than anything else. He barked at her whenever she lingered at the window, when her eyes locked on the frosty stretch of field outside. "Enough of this waiting," he told her. "Nothing is coming, Clara, nothing." But she would only nod slowly, as if hearing him but not believing it, her face strangely serene. Margaret, on the other hand, found herself torn between hope and dread. Part of her wanted to shake her daughter, to demand that she stop speaking of such things. Yet another part, the quieter, more fearful part, felt there was truth in Clara's words, a truth that had seeped into the family like winter air through cracked wood. At night, Margaret clutched her Bible, but as she whispered prayers, she heard her daughter's voice more clearly than the scripture. "I love you, Mama, and I love you. Papa, remember that when the frost comes." Neighbors began to notice that the Holloways had grown withdrawn. Samuel no longer lingered to exchange words at the general store. He kept his hat low, eyes fixed on the floor as he collected flour or nails. Margaret stopped visiting other women for sewing circles, excusing herself with headaches. And Clara, though never a child well embraced by her peers, now received glances more fearful than pitying. In whispered tones, mothers told their children not to walk too closely with her on the road to school. "That girl carries darkness," one woman muttered too loudly one Sunday morning, and Margaret, seated just a few pews away, burned with shame she could not shed. Then came the night that neighbors would not soon forget. As the frost thickened across the land, Clara's voice pierced through the stillness in ways that later spread in memory. Margaret would recall sitting in the kitchen, her daughter at the window, watching the steady breath of winter against the glass. Without turning, Clara said, "It feels closer now, Mama. I think the frost walks with me when I go outside." Her voice was quiet, steady, almost tender. Margaret clutched her chest, begging her to stop. But Clara only whispered, "Don't be afraid. It is gentle." The words rattled Margaret in a way that no prayer could soothe. She began to dream at night of empty fields, of a small dress swinging from the branches of a tree without a body inside. She awoke in sweat, whispering to Samuel that something was wrong, that they ought to act, do something, anything. Samuel's response remained hard as stone. "Do nothing. She talks and talks, but she will outgrow this. Fear feeds it, Margaret, and I won't give her that." Yet even Samuel, who wore disbelief like a shield, showed cracks. Some nights he could not sleep, staring down at his hands and recalling Clara's words at the fire. A week into the frost, a strange chill had settled, not just on the land, but inside the Holloway home itself. Food lost its taste, laughter had vanished, and silence stretched across their suppers like another guest at the table. Clara's journal filled with short lines more unsettling than before. "The light feels thinner today. I'm trying not to forget their faces. Shadows wait by the door." One evening, Margaret stole the small book while Clara slept, hoping to find childish sketches or nonsense that could comfort her. Instead, she read those words, her throat tightening until sobs broke through the quiet house. Samuel, seeing her with the journal, snatched it away and threw it into the fire without a second's thought. As the pages curled to ash, Clara watched from the stairwell above. Her face blank, but her eyes shimmering with something Margaret could not decipher, sorrow, or perhaps the knowledge that Samuel could not burn what was already written elsewhere. The frost did not retreat. Each morning brought heavier ice across the window panes, each night longer than the one before. Rumors in Fayette grew. People spoke of Clara Holloway like one speaks of storms, unavoidable, frightening, a reminder of forces beyond human control. Some suggested quietly to Reverend Collins that he pray over the girl, perhaps bless the Holloway house. Yet Samuel refused. "No man will come in here to call my daughter damned," he declared. Still, whispers carried on. By lantern light, neighbors said the child had seen her death, that her words had already cursed her. And though most laughed nervously afterward, none could entirely dismiss the chills her story placed in their bones. Then, in the thickest frost yet, the Holloways sat through a night that seemed too quiet. The farm animals stirred nervously, their breath steaming in the barn. Wind rattled the shutters, sharp as claws against wood. Margaret sat sewing, though she could barely see for the haze of tears in her eyes. Samuel lit and relit his pipe, dragging long draws of smoke, though it filled the room like fog. Clara sat silently in her chair near the fire, her hands folded. At last she spoke. "It will not be long now." Samuel slammed his hand against his knee and stood so fast his chair toppled back. "Silence, Clara. Enough of this. Do you hear me? Enough." His voice boomed, but it was desperate, cracked by something trembling underneath. Clara lifted her eyes and said softly, "I forgive you." "Papa, I know it's hard to hear." Margaret dropped her sewing, tears spilling openly as she cried, "Please, Clara, don't talk like this, please." The girl only turned her gaze to her mother, her voice calm as still water. "Don't be afraid, Mama, it will be gentle. And I will not be alone." That night sleep came late to the Holloway home. Margaret drifted uneasily, rising often to check on her daughter, as if expecting her to vanish in the dark. Samuel tossed in his bed, his jaw clenched, his fists curled. The frost pressed heavier than ever on the roof, as though the house itself were buckling under the weight of whatever it carried. By dawn, Margaret stepped outside, her breath sharp in the frozen air. The world was covered in crystalline whiteness. Silence stretched over the fields, and when she turned back to the doorway, she saw Clara standing barefoot at the threshold, her hair hanging loose, her eyes fixed on the frost, as though it were beckoning her forward. Margaret screamed, drawing the barefoot girl back inside, pulling her into her arms. Clara leaned against her mother's chest without struggle and whispered, "It is closer, but don't cry. I am not afraid." From that morning on, Margaret began to count her daughter's breaths whenever she was near her, as if memorizing each one could hold Clara longer. Samuel worked harder than ever, his body bent beneath the burden of denial, refusing to acknowledge what seemed to unfold. Clara moved like a shadow through the house, her calm unbroken. Neighbors who saw her in passing said later that there was something unsettling in her face, that it was too peaceful, the peace of someone resigned. The frost did not give way. And every day that passed bound the Holloways tighter to the fear of words spoken by a child who had foretold her own end. The Holloway family carried on under the frost, but each day felt heavier than the last. Margaret no longer hummed hymns while she worked, her voice too tight with fear. Samuel, once a man who spoke only when necessary, grew quieter still, his silence carrying frustration he dared not voice. And Clara, calm and unshaken, became a figure who moved through the house like an echo, present, yet already belonging to something beyond their grasp. Word of the Holloway girl had spread far across Fayette and beyond its dusty edges. In the general store, men leaned over barrels of seed and whispered about what they had heard, shaking their heads but repeating the words all the same. In the churchyard, women shared the story in hushed tones, even as they scolded themselves for spreading it further. It was always framed as concern or pity, but behind their eyes there was fear. No one could deny that Clara had said it long before the frost arrived, and now the frost had come just as she promised. To the people of Fayette, such coincidences did not sit calmly. One evening, Reverend Collins himself came to the Holloway home. His knock at the door startled Margaret, who answered with her hands trembling. He stood tall and grim, his Bible tucked beneath his arm. "Sister Margaret," he said with a solemn bow of his head, "I have come to pray for your family, and most especially for your daughter." Samuel, hearing this, rose from his chair, his face dark with resentment. "We need no one at our table tonight, Reverend," he growled. But Collins would not retreat so easily. "Brother Holloway, I know your pride, but the Lord calls us to banish lies of the devil. If the child has spoken of death, it is not the Lord's tongue she speaks with." Margaret felt her heart nearly stop. She looked at Clara, who sat near the window, calm as ever. Without raising her voice, Clara answered the Reverend herself. "I am not lied to, Reverend," she said evenly. "I only know what is coming. That is all." Collins stiffened, his knuckles curling white around his Bible. "It is not for children to know such things." Clara held his gaze, calm as stone. "Children die too, Reverend. Some before their time." The room fell silent. Margaret collapsed into her chair in tears. Samuel stormed past the Reverend, pointing toward the door. "You'll not come into this house and call my daughter a servant of darkness. Good night, Reverend." And with that, Collins was gone, his jaw tight, his boots striking the frozen ground outside. Yet his sermon that Sunday burned with new fire. He spoke of families who let unholy words go unchecked, of households who invited ruin by ignoring the devil's whispers. And though no names were given, everyone in the pews knew the Holloways were the subject. Life for them only grew lonelier. Neighbors shrank further away, and children on the path to school avoided Clara altogether, moving quickly past her, as though her very presence might summon misfortune. Margaret bore the shame heavily, her prayers growing more desperate, her hands raw from wringing them in silence. Samuel resisted every attempt to speak of it. He worked longer hours in the fields, returning home covered in frost and dirt, his expression tight with the effort of pretending nothing was wrong. Yet it clung to him, evident to all who knew him. Clara, meanwhile, became almost spectral in her composure. At night, she would sit by the fire, gazing into the flames, not with despair, but with a strange serenity. Margaret often asked, "Why do you not cry, Clara? Why do you not fight against such thoughts?" And Clara would answer, her voice so quiet yet steady enough to pierce through her mother's heart, "Because this is not something to fight against, Mama. The frost does not weep when it comes. It simply falls." Margaret would break into weeping, clutching her daughter, begging her to stop this talk. Samuel would bark angrily, "No more of this death in my house." But Clara remained composed. Her lack of fear frightened them more than her words ever could. The frost deepened into December, heavier than any had expected that year. Families mourned ruined crops, hungry cattle, and the prospect of a bitter winter. The frost became the great enemy of Fayette, but in whispered places people said it was drawn to the Holloway farm, that it lingered heavier on their fields than anywhere else. Some swore that when the moon was high, they saw Clara standing barefoot in the frost, her white breath rising like smoke, her eyes turned skyward as though she were listening to something no one else could hear. Margaret tried to keep her indoors, but again and again she found her daughter at the threshold, staring into the pale stillness. On Christmas morning, While most of Fayette gathered at church for the solemn hymns, the Holloway family remained at home. Samuel claimed it was because of the cold, but in truth he wanted to avoid the eyes that lingered on them with suspicion. Clara sat before the fire, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. She whispered softly, "It will not be long now." Margaret's tears fell openly, while Samuel gripped his chair so hard his knuckles turned white. That night, Margaret dreamed of frost covering Clara's bed, burying her beneath a blanket of white, while the rest of the house remained untouched. She woke gasping, rushing to her daughter's room only to find her asleep, her small body warm beneath the quilt. Yet she lay motionless in her sleep, still as if carved in stone, her face turned toward the window where ice etched itself into patterns like delicate fingers grasping the glass. The days that followed moved like slow torture. Margaret began to pray aloud, walking the house with her Bible, whispering verses under her breath while Samuel kept his distance, stomping through the farm as though labor itself could halt what was coming. Clara watched it all with a quietness that unsettled them both. She spoke less frequently now, but when she did, her words carried the weight of finality. "The frost is heavier each morning. I think it is waiting for me." Margaret could bear it no longer. One evening, clutching Clara's hands tightly, she said with desperate urgency, "Promise me, Clara, say you are wrong. Just once, say it isn't true. For me." Clara held her mother's trembling hands but did not smile. "I cannot lie, Mama, even for you." Samuel, unable to bear another word, stormed out into the icy night. His figure disappeared into the fields, his silence deeper than any argument could have been. Margaret watched him go, her heart breaking under the weight of what no one could change. In those days of biting frost and quiet despair, one question consumed the Holloway family. Was Clara truly foretelling her death, or was she shaping it with her words, pulling it closer with every sentence spoken? No one could say, and yet the house seemed to breathe that question with every frosted pane and every whispered prayer. And as the year turned into 1882, Missouri lay under the grip of winter, and the Holloways braced themselves for whatever the frost would bring. The new year arrived under a sky as pale as bone, the air sharp enough to sting any breath that lingered too long outdoors. Frost had become the constant companion of Fayette, transforming fences into glittering spines and fields into barren, lifeless plains. For most families, January was a burden to endure, a time of thin meals and heavy prayers. But for the Holloways, the weight of January settled with a pressure that none of the neighbors could fully imagine. Margaret carried it in her eyes, raw and swollen from tears. Samuel bore it in his silence, which seemed at times thicker than ice. And Clara, though small and fragile, carried it as though she had expected it all along. It was Samuel who began to feel the strain most visibly. He had clung to disbelief for so long, insisting that his daughter's words were nothing but foolishness. Yet as the frost persisted, and as he saw her move about the house with the calm presence of one resigned to fate, even his certainty began to bend. There were evenings when he sat in the barn alone, the lantern burning while his hands hung limp over his knees. He would whisper into the hay, though no one was there to hear him, "Lord, don't take her. Not like this. Not like this." But Samuel never spoke these words aloud to his family. To Margaret he gave only his harshness, an armor to cover his own fear. To Clara he showed impatience that masked his dread. More than once he struck the table with his fist and told her, "Enough of your talk. You will see March, you will see harvest. You'll outgrow this, and that is the end of it." Clara, calm and unflinching, would nod her small head and whisper back, "I hope so, Papa, but I don't think I will." Margaret grew weaker with every day. Her prayers had become endless, muttered from morning to night, spilling from her lips even when she prepared meals or scrubbed clothes. She begged God to intervene, to rewrite what she feared had already been written. Yet faith, once her strongest companion, now hollowed under the dread of watching her daughter's strange certainty. Slowly, Margaret began to wonder if God was not answering her at all, or if Clara's words were an answer she simply could not bear to accept. Neighbors continued to gossip, though fewer came near. Those who did risk the Holloway farm left quickly, claiming the air there felt different, heavier, almost like a warning. One man swore he saw Clara barefoot in the snow at dawn, her white nightdress rippling in the wind as she stared across the fields. Whether true or a tale reshaped by fear, the story caught fire in Fayette, further isolating the Holloways. By now most children crossed the street rather than walk near Clara on their way to school. Some muttered mockingly under their breath, calling her the ghost girl, but even those taunts carried fear beneath the bravado. Inside the Holloway home, the frost seemed to creep past the windows and walls. Some nights the temperature dipped so low that water froze solid in the basins. Breath lingered in the air like smoke, and the fire in the hearth sputtered against the cold. Margaret pressed Clara close beneath quilts, rubbing her arms to keep her warm. "Don't you leave me, Clara," she whispered desperately. "Not while I'm holding you. Promise me you'll stay." Clara only leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "I don't decide it, Mama. The frost does." The words ripped through Margaret more than any winter wind ever could. She broke into sobs, clutching Clara tighter, as though the force of her love could anchor the child to the world. Samuel, sitting by the fire, turned his face away to hide the tears he would never admit shedding. One night, in the deepest freeze, Clara spoke again words that would never be forgotten. The Holloways were at supper, bread hard as stone from the cold, beans simmering weakly in the pot. Silence pressed down as much as hunger did. Clara set her spoon aside and looked at her parents with her steady green eyes. "When it happens," she said softly, "don't blame yourselves. It isn't your fault." "It is only the way it must be," Margaret gasped, her hand dropping to the table. "Stop it, Clara!" she cried. "Stop it this instant! You are just a child. You can't know these things." Tears blurred her vision, but Clara's words had rooted deep in her mind. Samuel slammed his spoon down. "Enough! Not another word of this nonsense." His voice cracked like ice breaking beneath heavy boots. But Clara only nodded, and in her quiet way her words lingered even after silence returned to the table. Another week passed, and with each day Clara's strength seemed to falter in small ways. She grew pale, her appetite thin. Margaret noticed the lilting of her steps, how sometimes her breath rose sharp too soon. When she urged her to rest, Clara calmly replied, "It doesn't matter, Mama, rest won't change anything." Margaret begged Samuel to fetch a doctor, but he refused. "I'll not waste what little we have on some man to tell me my child's been talking herself sick. She'll be fine." Yet she was not fine, and both of them could see it, though they could not bring themselves to speak it aloud. It was during this time that Margaret's faith began to take on a strange form. She had once prayed for God to save her daughter, but now she found herself praying instead for the strength to let go. "If it is thy will," she whispered into the still hours of the night, "then let her pass gently. Spare her pain. Spare me the breaking, Lord, even if it is impossible." Samuel caught her once, her hands trembling over the Bible at the table. He stared at her with something close to betrayal. "You've given up already?" he barked. "You let her believe it, you feed it. If she goes, Margaret, it's because you let her." She recoiled as if he had struck her. But her tears answered what her mouth could not, and still Clara pressed on, calm and composed. To her it was no longer a question of belief. It was inevitability, and as January deepened, each breath of cold air in the Holloway house seemed to draw them closer to the moment Clara had spoken of, the moment that hung over them like the frost itself. The final days of the month crawled forward with unbearable weight. The ground was white as bone, the sky grey and low. Samuel rose before dawn each morning, striking the frozen earth with his boots, pretending to ignore the terror blooming in his chest. Margaret never left Clara's side for long, hovering like a shadow of protection. And Clara, pale but steady, carried herself with that eerie serenity that unnerved them more than tears would have. By the last Sunday of January, the Holloways could no longer deny it. Something was coming. They did not know what form it would take, nor when exactly it would strike. But Clara had spoken, and Clara had never once faltered. The frost crept heavier each night, and the family found themselves waiting, fearful, restless, and powerless, for the shadow that had been promised. February arrived with no mercy. The frost showed no signs of loosening its grip, and the Missouri landscape lay still beneath its frozen veil. Fayette's families kept close to their stoves and fires, rationing what little remained of their harvest, praying for an early thaw. Farmers cursed the sky, their labor stolen by the cold. But at the Holloway farm, the frost carried a different meaning, something that could not be measured in lost crops or hungry cattle. For Samuel and Margaret, every frosted morning felt like a countdown, every silent night a step closer to something they could neither prevent nor define. Samuel withdrew into himself. His disbelief, once firm and unyielding, had begun to collapse into a quiet dread. It showed in the lines of his face, the way he sat staring at the fields from the porch, his pipe dangling unlit between his fingers. Sometimes when Margaret approached him, she felt as though he had aged 10 years in just these few weeks. He spoke little now, and when he did, his words carried an edge sharper than the cold itself. "This is foolishness," he muttered more than once. "She feeds on the attention, and you let her. Children don't foretell death. The world doesn't work that way." But the conviction was gone from his voice. Deep inside, he knew he was no longer convincing himself. Margaret, on the other hand, had surrendered almost entirely to Clara's words. She stayed close to her daughter, studying her every movement as if expecting her to vanish at any moment. She often broke into tears without warning, clinging to Clara until the girl calmly patted her shoulder and whispered, "Don't cry. Mama, I'll be all right." Those words only shattered Margaret further, for Clara spoke them not with a child's fear, but with the certainty of someone preparing her mother for loss. Clara herself seemed untouched by the weight that crushed her parents. She was pale, weaker than before, but her serenity never wavered. She moved through the frost-bitten house like a presence both fragile and unshakable. In the evenings, she sat quietly by the fire, staring into the flames until her eyes reflected their light. "The frost is patient," she whispered once so softly that Margaret barely heard. "It knows when the time is right." Margaret clutched her chest, whispering prayers in return, but Clara's voice had already buried itself deep inside her. The community of Fayette was no kinder in February than it had been before. If anything, the isolation of the Holloways grew worse. People were too eager to spread stories of the Holloway child, tales bent from truth and twisted by fear. Rumors circulated that Clara had once predicted the death of a neighbor's cow, that her words alone had cursed last year's fields, that anyone who lingered too long near her would invite misfortune into their homes. Though people claimed not to believe such superstitions, their actions betrayed them. No one visited the Holloways. No one offered help. The family stood alone, wrapped in both frost and whispers. One evening, Samuel walked into Fayette for supplies. Men gathered at the general store fell into silence as he entered, then quickly pretended to resume their talk. He felt their eyes on him, felt the pity mixed with suspicion. As he paid for flour and salt, the storekeeper spoke hesitantly. "Hard winter, Samuel. Harder for some than others, folks say. Well, they say this frost sits heavier on your land than any other farm. Don't take it wrong, but maybe a prayer circle could ease it off your home." Samuel's jaw clenched tight. He slammed the coins onto the counter and muttered, "My farm carries no curse, and my daughter is no witch. Mind your business." He left with the sack slung over his shoulder, but his heart beat hot in his chest, his hands shaking with rage and helplessness. At home, Margaret had grown frightened, not just of the frost's promise, but of Samuel's growing silence. She tried to draw words from him, but he pushed her away with bitterness he did not mean. "You coddle her too much," he snapped one night. "You let her fill your head with her talk. You've started believing her too, haven't you?" Margaret broke into sobs, nodding despite herself. "Yes," she admitted. "How can I not believe her, Samuel? She knows something we don't, and I feel it too." Samuel turned away, slamming his fist against the table. His body shook with all the things he could not say, the fear he held, the dread already swallowing him. Clara overheard from the stairwell, her small figure standing quietly in shadow. She did not interrupt, did not speak. She simply regarded her parents with calm, as if watching them struggle against a tide she knew could not be turned. Later, as Margaret tucked her into bed, Clara touched her mother's face and whispered, "It isn't your fault, Mama. And it isn't Papa's. We don't choose the frost. It chooses us." Margaret wept silently, clutching her child's hand until sleep finally claimed Clara's small form. Samuel, though hardened, began to break in ways subtle yet clear. One night, after another argument, he stepped outside to the yard. The sky above was black velvet, sprinkled with stars, the air biting against his skin. He stared across the frozen fields and whispered into the night, "If there's a God, prove her wrong. Let me wake tomorrow and see her running through these fields in the spring." His voice cracked, carrying across the silent land, but the only answer was the soft creak of ice settling across the soil. He returned to the house that night defeated, though he would not admit it aloud. By mid-February, Clara began to tire more easily. She no longer walked through the house with her steady steps, but lingered near the fire, her breath occasionally short. Margaret hovered constantly, offering tea, bread, blankets, anything that might anchor her. But Clara, with her soft smile, always declined. "It's all right, Mama. It will be gentle." Samuel grew more panicked in his silence, refusing still to call for a doctor, but watching his daughter with eyes that betrayed his fear. He had no words left, only clenched fists and sleepless nights. There were moments in those days when the house seemed to dim with something unspoken. Margaret once woke past midnight to hear Clara humming quietly in her room, the tune unfamiliar yet strangely mournful. When she entered, Clara looked up with clear eyes and said, "I'm practicing so I won't forget how songs sound." Margaret knelt at her bedside, sobbing into her daughter's lap, but Clara only stroked her hair gently, as though she were the mother instead. The Holloway home became a place of whispers. Clara's whispers of calm inevitability, Margaret's whispered prayers, and Samuel's whispered curses directed at both heaven and earth. Silence filled the spaces between those whispers, binding them in tension none of them could escape. Outside, the frost thickened its grip, wrapping the land, tightening each night like ropes around the family's heart. By the final days of February, even Samuel's resolve shattered. He sat at the edge of Clara's bed one night, his rugged hands folded tightly. For the first time, his voice cracked into vulnerability. "Don't leave me, Clara," he whispered. "I don't know how to stop it. Just tell me what to do." Clara turned her head, her green eyes steady, her expression tender. "There's nothing to do, Papa. Just remember me. And don't be angry anymore." Samuel broke into tears he could no longer withhold, burying his face into his calloused hands, while his daughter reached out to rest her tiny hand on his arm. The frost outside lingered with relentless patience, and the household fell deeper into silence. Clara's words had become prophecy to them all, whether they admitted it or not. February passed slowly, each day bringing them closer to the shadow that never seemed to leave the house. And as winter showed no sign of retreat, Margaret and Samuel realized they were no longer waiting for harvests or warmth. They were waiting for whatever fate their daughter had foretold. March crept slowly upon the town of Fayette, though the land showed no sign of release from winter's grip. The frost still clung stubbornly to the earth, though the days stretched a little longer, their light spilling gently over the frozen soil. Farmers prayed the thaw was near, for every day of hard ground meant leaner meals and thinner stock. Yet for the Holloways, March brought not hope but dread, for it carried with it the sense that Clara's words were running out of time. Margaret had stopped sleeping soundly altogether. Night after night, she drifted from her daughter's bedside to the window, her prayers interrupted by the fear that when she turned back, Clara would no longer be there. Dark circles rimmed her eyes. Her hands shook when she tried to sew or cook. She clung to Clara as if holding her close would anchor her to life itself. Many times she pleaded, "Say it's not true, Clara, even if you don't believe it, just say it for my sake." But Clara only returned the same quiet gaze, her green eyes glinting like ice in candlelight. "I can't, Mama, I can't lie to you." Samuel had grown gaunt himself, though not from sickness but from the torment of silence. He spent hours outside in the fields, hacking at the frozen soil, as though sheer force could break through the cold and bring back spring. His arms bruised with the effort, his breath steamed in the frozen air, yet the earth did not yield, and his heart grew heavier with each attempt. Margaret begged him not to exhaust himself, but he refused to stop. "If I can break ground here," he muttered one night, mud frozen to his boots, "then maybe I can break what's over her head." Yet both of them knew the soil outside was not the only thing refusing to be broken. Clara herself had weakened. Her walks upstairs became slower, and her steps often faltered. Twice Margaret caught her clinging to the railing, her small body trembling from something that looked more like frailty than cold. "You must rest," Margaret demanded as she guided her daughter back into her bed. Clara only whispered, "I don't mind, Mama. I don't need much strength now." Margaret buried her face in her hands and wept. At supper, Clara ate lightly, picking at her bread with thin fingers. Samuel, though silent, finally slammed his hand on the table and growled, "You'll eat what's on your plate. Food doesn't grow on trees, Clara." Clara lifted her eyes to him, not angry but soft. "I'll try, Papa, but it won't help." "You know it won't." Samuel turned away sharply, his jaw clenched, his eyes brimming. He could no longer mask the terror beneath his anger. Around Fayette, whispers continued. Stories were reshaped, exaggerated, retold with trembling fascination. Neighbors said the Holloway girl had gone pale as snow, that she walked between frost and shadow, that she had already whispered the date of her death into her mother's ear. Men in the tavern remarked that the Holloways were cursed, that perhaps Samuel himself had angered God somehow. Others said Clara was a sign, proof of the Lord's punishment falling on Missouri through the coldest winter in years. None of the Holloways heard these words directly, but Margaret felt their weight all the same, during each awkward glance at the general store, each long silence broken as soon as she entered a room. They were alone now, completely, unbearably alone. The days crawled forward into March, each colder than the last. Clara's health grew more fragile. She tired after only a few steps, her face pale, her lips often dry. Margaret hovered at her side every waking moment, propping her up, pouring tea, muttering prayers. Samuel shifted into a restless frenzy, avoiding the house, lingering in the barn longer than necessary, as if distance might ease the dread he carried. At night, however, the silence brought him back into the weight of his fear. He would sit awake, hearing his daughter's voice in memory, the words that never loosened their grip. When the first frost comes, don't be afraid. It will take me like the flowers. One evening, Clara whispered something that struck both her parents like a shattering storm. As she sat by the fire with the flames flickering on her cheeks, she looked at her mother and father in turn. I don't fear it, she said softly, but I fear leaving you. That's the only sorrow I have. Margaret froze, her tears spilling instantly. Samuel stared at her with pale, broken eyes, his lips trembling though he said nothing. Clara folded her hands gently in her lap and added, Promise me you'll remember me smiling and not ill. Margaret collapsed into sobs, while Samuel rose to leave the room, afraid that if he stayed a second longer, his voice would betray him completely. The days after that moment pressed down like heavy clouds. Clara's condition seemed to shift between stillness and fragility, the kind that filled Margaret with sleepless terror, yet Clara herself remained calm, as though accepting what was to come carried her through each moment. Sometimes she would look through the frosted window panes and whisper, It's waiting. The frost is patient. Margaret tried to hush her, begged her to stop speaking, but Clara only smiled faintly, as though her mother's panic had no power over the certainty she felt. Then, mid-March brought a morning like no other. Margaret awoke to birdsong, the first in weeks. She rushed to the window, her breath catching at the sight of ice melting along the fence posts, pale shoots of brown grass struggling through. The thaw had begun. She fell to her knees in gratitude, whispering frantic prayers, convinced that perhaps Clara's words had been wrong. See, Clara, she said, forcing brightness into her voice as she pressed her daughter's thin hand. The frost is leaving. She'll see spring yet. Clara, too weak to sit upright alone, only gave her a faint smile. The frost may leave the earth, Mama, she whispered, her voice breaking, but not me. Margaret gasped, fighting to swallow against the lump hardening in her throat. Her hope, rekindled moments before, drained away like water vanishing into frozen soil. That night, Samuel finally broke. He sat at Clara's bedside while Margaret dozed nearby, her hand clutched around her daughter's arm even in sleep. Samuel leaned forward, his rough fingers brushing against Clara's thin hand. In a voice cracked and fragile, he whispered, What do I do when you're gone, Clara? She turned her head, her eyes half closed, her breath shallow. Work the fields, Papa, she murmured. Love Mama, and remember that I loved you. Samuel's breath caught as hot tears fell down his face. The man who had lived half his life without crying now crumbled entirely at those words. He pressed his face into her quilt, unable to speak further. The thaw continued in the days that followed, but inside the Holloway house, the frost seemed heavier than ever. The air was thick, oppressive, as though waiting with them for the end. Margaret's prayers were no longer for salvation, but for mercy. She prayed that when Clara's time came, it would not bring suffering, only peace. Samuel's prayers, when he still forced them, were unshaped and jagged, angry cries to the heavens that gave him no comfort. Clara herself spoke less and less, her strength diminished. Yet the few words she still gave carried weight. One late evening she whispered, her voice nearly gone, It will be soon. Mama, don't be afraid. Margaret wept openly into her daughter's frail body as the fire dimmed in the hearth. March pressed on, And though the frost melted beyond their fields, the Holloways carried it into their hearts. And as the days shortened toward the inevitable, the family finally understood. Clara's prophecy was not about the frost outside their windows. It was about the frost that had always lingered within their home, unrelenting, patient, and waiting. The thaw had begun across Missouri, but at the Holloway farm there lingered a stillness that no sunshine could touch. The air outside carried hints of spring, dripping water from the eaves, soft earth beginning to replace the frozen ground. Yet inside the house everything felt colder than before, as though Clara's prophecy had drawn the frost inward, holding the family in its grip, even as the world outside slowly breathed again. Margaret refused to leave her daughter's side. She sat near the bed night and day, her Bible open though her eyes rarely touched its words. Her prayers had grown softer now, worn down by exhaustion, rising in murmured pleas for mercy rather than miracles. She brushed back Clara's fine brown hair, studying her child's pallid face, as though trying to commit every line, every detail, to memory. "Stay with me," she whispered constantly, though she no longer believed that her words could stop what was coming. Samuel had withdrawn from both Margaret and Clara, yet his absence was not physical. He stayed near them, pacing, lingering at the door, sinking into the chair by the fire. But something in him had broken entirely. For weeks he had fought against Clara's words with anger, denial, and silence, trying to bend the world back into sense. Now he was left with nothing in his hands at all. He spoke little, his jaw set, his face pale and sunken, his eyes dim. But sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his body betrayed him. His shoulders quaked. His hands trembled against the tabletop. Silent sobs struck him in the dark when he could not force them back any longer. Clara, once filled with unnerving serenity, had grown quiet, not in spirit, but in strength. Her whispers were fewer now, her body too weak. She lay much of the day still against her pillows, her eyes half shut, though when they opened they remained strikingly clear, carrying that same calm that seemed to know too much for her years. Margaret often searched those eyes for fear, for some reflection of her own desperate dread. But there was none. Only quiet acceptance, the kind that felt unbearable to those who loved her. The Holloways had become figures of myth in Fayette by March's second week. Neighbors avoided even speaking their names aloud, but in hushed circles they repeated the tale. The Holloway girl foretold her own death, some said. She said the frost would take her, and it will. Others claimed she was already gone in spirit, her body lingering between worlds. No one dared visit their home anymore. Even Reverend Collins, who had once pressed on in righteous anger, now kept his distance as if afraid of encountering proof of what he had denounced. Alone they remained, sealed into their pain as if the frost itself had carved them from the rest of the living. It was on one particularly sharp morning, though the thaw had begun, frost still lingered stubborn across the Holloway yard, that Clara called out faintly to her mother. Margaret hurried to her side, clutching her thin, fragile hands. Clara's lips moved through shallow breath. "Mama, don't be afraid." Margaret broke then, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pressed her lips to her daughter's hair. "I don't know how to do this, Clara. I don't know how to let you go." Clara's voice was barely there, but strong enough to carry its meaning. "You don't let me go." "You carry me." Samuel stood in the doorway, his face contorted, his fists clenched so tightly the skin had nearly split. He wanted to shout, to tear against heaven and earth, but no sound came. He sank into the chair near the fire, his head in his hands, unable to fight any longer. His daughter's words had finally cut through every wall he had built. The hours dragged, and yet they slid forward quickly, the air taking on the kind of heaviness that precedes what is final. Margaret clutched Clara's hand, murmuring psalms through shaking lips. Samuel rose now and then, pacing in frantic silence before collapsing again into his chair. But Clara remained steady, fragile yet composed, her breaths thin but even. As dusk fell, the last light of the sun filtered across the frost outside, glinting in sharp fragments, as though the earth itself were breaking apart into silver glass. Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open to gaze at the window. "The frost," she whispered. "It's so beautiful tonight." Margaret followed her gaze, unable to see beauty in what felt like ice around her throat. She sobbed openly, pressing her daughter's hand against her face. "Stay, my darling," she begged. "Just stay." Clara shook her head ever so faintly. "I told you, Mama, it takes me too. Don't be afraid." Her eyes shifted then to Samuel, who sat frozen in place, his breath heaving. She smiled faintly, her lips cracked but determined. "Papa," she whispered, "I love you." The words broke him completely. He dropped to his knees by her bedside, burying his face against the quilt, sobs tearing from him uncontrollably. Margaret wept with him, her body trembling as she clung to Clara's other hand. Clara's breaths grew shallower, each one stretched thinner than the last. Her green eyes flickered as if struggling to stay open, yet even in those final moments they carried no fear. Her final whisper, carried through the still air of the Holloway house, was soft and fragile but certain. "It's gentle," and with that silence enveloped the room. The fire in the hearth crackled faintly, the frost outside glittered, and for the first time since the prophecy began, the dreadful waiting was over. Clara Holloway lay still, her small body resting as peacefully as if she had merely fallen asleep. Margaret collapsed forward, her cries pouring desperately into her daughter's hair. Samuel knelt motionless, his sobs drained, unable to move. The frost lingered on the windows well into that night, the world outside as quiet as the home itself. Neighbors in Fayette would speak later of how they felt the cold deepen across their farms at that very hour, as if the night belonged to the Holloways. They had no way of knowing, but behind those walls, the prophecy of Clara Holloway had fulfilled itself, not as magic, not as curse, but as a haunting truth carried in the words of a child who had seen her end long before it arrived. The morning after Clara's passing came heavy with stillness. Outside, a thin film of frost clung to the earth, as though unwilling to depart, but sunlight broke gently over the farms of Howard County. Roosters crowed in the distance, cattle stirred, and the ordinary rhythms of rural Missouri carried forward, as though nothing had changed. Yet within the Holloway home everything had changed. The world had not lost its step, but Samuel and Margaret had lost their child, and their home no longer felt like the place it once had been. Margaret was the first to rise, though she had not truly slept. She had spent the night by Clara's side, her arms curled protectively over her daughter's still form, as if shields of warmth could convince the body to stir again. When light filled the room, she sat there trembling, her face pale and drawn, eyes hollow but swollen red from endless tears. She did not release Clara until Samuel approached, his face rigid, his movements mechanical, and gently placed a hand over Margaret's shoulder. He did not speak. He could not. But the weight of his touch was enough to draw her into trembling silence. Together, they prepared their daughter with quiet, halting movements. Margaret smoothed Clara's hair again and again with shaking hands, whispering through sobs, "My sweet girl, my sweet, sweet girl," while Samuel gathered quilts from the cedar chest, wrapping them around the girl's small body, as though she were still alive and threatened by the cold. Margaret wanted to fight, to scream, to deny reality, but Clara looked too peaceful, her prophecy too fulfilled, for denial to hold another moment. Word traveled quickly through Fayette, faster even than the thaw. By mid-morning, whispers carried to every home, every family, every corner of the small Missouri town. The Holloway girl had passed, just as she said she would. At first there was silence among those sharing the tale, a silence edged with awe, confusion, disbelief. But awe soon gave way to fear. The townspeople remembered too clearly what Clara had said, repeated too many times to be ignored. And now, with her death here at the close of winter, it was undeniable. She had spoken truth. Some whispered that she was a blessed child, gifted with a vision, taken by God before sin could stain her soul. Others muttered darker things, that she had been cursed from birth, doomed to drag misfortune upon her family. A few refused to speak of her at all, as though silence itself could banish the discomfort of what her words had foretold. But everyone knew of it, and everyone carried it in their hearts. The Holloways, meanwhile, bore their grief in painful isolation. Many neighbors avoided their farm altogether, afraid of being near the place where prophecy had lived, and death had walked so precisely. Those who did approach often stood awkwardly at the fence instead of entering, hats clutched in their hands, voices low with condolences that sounded empty. Margaret longed for comfort, for an embrace, but most who came were too unsettled to offer what she needed. Samuel barely acknowledged their words, answering with silence or nods, his face taut and unreadable, his grief expressed only in the tired slump of his shoulders. Margaret wept freely for hours at a time, She wandered the house like a ghost, her prayers now broken cries, pleading not for miracles but for strength to rise from her chair each morning. In the kitchen, she often found herself preparing Clara's favorite porridge before realizing the futility and collapsing back into tears. Her grief came like waves, sudden and crushing, drowning any thought of peace. At night she dreamed of Clara's small footsteps pattering through the hall, only to wake and find silence staring back at her. Samuel's grief unfurled differently. He buried himself in the fields, turning soil still hard with lingering frost, striking relentlessly at the land with his plough and axe. His hands blistered, his back ached, but the labor gave him no escape. More than once Margaret found him kneeling in the dirt, not working at all, just staring blankly across the fields as if waiting for Clara to emerge once more. When Margaret begged him to come inside, he only shook his head, muttering, "I have work to do. If the ground still lives, then so must I." Yet his eyes told a different story, eyes of a man hollowed by something he did not know how to endure. The funeral was a small, somber affair. Reverend Collins preached the sermon, his words careful, measured, though none in the church missed the undertone of unease. He spoke of life and death, of mysteries known only to God, but when his eyes flickered toward Clara's small coffin, they betrayed something close to fear. The congregation sat stiffly, their murmurs hushed, their gazes uncertain. To many present, Clara was more than a child being buried. She was a question none of them wanted to face, a question about fate, about knowledge, about whether death could truly be seen before it came. Margaret wept openly throughout the service, unable to contain her sorrow. Samuel sat rigid, lips tight, fists clenched against his knees. Not one tear left his eyes before the crowd, though his jaw trembled as though dammed against an unstoppable river. When they lowered Clara into the ground, Margaret nearly collapsed with the sound of earth striking the wood. Samuel held her, his grip tight, but inside he too was unraveling. Afterward, some townsfolk approached with awkward words of comfort. A woman laid a hand on Margaret's arm, whispering, "She was a special child too good for this earth." Another muttered that perhaps it was best her suffering was short. Those words rang empty, half-hearted. Samuel turned away from each one, guiding Margaret back toward the wagon as quickly as he could. On the ride home they sat in silence, the wheels crunching over frozen ground, neither daring to speak. In the weeks that followed, the Holloway farm became darker than the frost. Margaret sank deeper into grief, moving like a woman half alive, her faith tested so sharply she no longer recognized her own prayers. Samuel grew quieter still, his silence a wall she could not breach. They were two people bound in sorrow yet separated by it, mourning the same child, but in ways so different they could not always reach for each other. Sometimes, at night, Samuel would hear Margaret whispering Clara's name over and over, like she hoped repetition might summon her back. And sometimes Margaret would hear Samuel pacing outside on the porch, muttering words torn between prayer and curse, his voice hoarse with anguish. They grieved differently, but their grief was endless. Meanwhile, Fayette carried on, though changed in subtle ways. Clara's prophecy became part of the town's hidden lore. Children would whisper her name when dared to test their courage. Mothers warned their little ones not to speak of death, lest they end up like Clara Holloway. Men around the tavern spoke of her in hushed awe, shaking their heads before taking long swigs of beer. The Holloway name became forever joined with mystery, both pitied and feared. No one looked at Samuel and Margaret the same again, for to all of Fayette, they were not merely farmers, they were the parents of the girl who knew she would die. Alone in their grief, the Holloways walked their land in silence, waiting not for spring nor harvest, but simply for time itself to carry them beyond the unbearable shadow of Clara's prophecy. The frost eventually melted from the earth, but it never left their home, never left their souls. For Samuel and Margaret, the question would linger until their own ends. Had Clara been given a cruel gift of sight, or had her words, repeated again and again, shaped the very fate she foresaw? That was what haunted them most, that they would never ever know. Spring finally arrived in Howard County. Snow melted into rivulets of muddy water, frost-laced fences turned slick in the thaw, and the first stubborn shoots of green appeared across the battered fields. Farmers lifted their heads with cautious relief, planting seed with hope that the year's harvest might recover from the winter's cruel grip. In Fayette, Children returned to their games, mothers to their routines, and men to their labor. The rhythms of rural life pressed forward, as they always did. Yet for one home, time did not move on so easily. At the Holloway farm, the thaw brought only silence. The house stood unchanged, its porch groaning under Samuel's boots, its chimneys breathing softly against the pale spring sky. But inside, everything carried the echo of absence. Clara's empty chair by the fire, her quilts folded carefully at the end of her small bed, her writing slate propped forgotten in the corner, each one a reminder of the girl whose prophecy had lingered too long to be denied. Margaret moved through the home like an apparition. Her prayers had become fewer, her voice no longer steady but broken and uncertain. She clung to the Bible still, but where once it had been her lifeline, now it felt to her like a book of questions. Sometimes she stopped midway through a verse, her whisper faltering as her tears fell onto the fragile pages. She spoke Clara's name often, as though repeating it into the stillness would somehow preserve its weight. Refusing to let the house forget the sound of her daughter's voice, Samuel bore his grief differently. His silence deepened into something unmovable, a wall between himself and the world. He worked his fields with brutal resolve, breaking soil with a force that seemed less about the harvest than about trying to bury the memory pressing down on him. At night, he sat stiffly in the rocking chair by the hearth, unmoving, staring into the flames. Margaret would sometimes whisper to him, reaching out tentatively, but his replies were short, his words carved thin by sorrow and by shame. He had spent so long denying Clara's words that now, with her prophecy fulfilled, he could not shake the question that haunted him. Had his dismissal driven her closer to the grave, or had he been powerless all along? Neighbors in Fayette continued their lives, but not without carrying Clara's story in their whispers. To some, she was the blessed child who glimpsed eternity before it was her time, her foresight a sign of heaven's touch. To others, she remained a figure of unease, something unnatural, a reminder that death could be foretold and powerless to stop. Her name became almost like folklore, especially among the children. They dared each other to repeat her words, "The frost will take me," in darkened barns or quiet fields, as if invoking her story might summon the same chill. Parents scolded their children, warning them against jesting with death, but even they retold the tale behind shuttered doors. Voices hushed, unable to resist the weight of its mystery. The Holloways lived under that shadow longer than the frost itself. Invitations dwindled, neighbors kept distance, and Sunday service remained an ordeal. Margaret sometimes sat weeping quietly in the pew, while Samuel, stiff-backed and silent, endured the lingering glances cast their way. Reverend Collins, for all his fire, never spoke Clara's name again from the pulpit. Instead, his sermons grew careful, veering away from prophecy or fate, but silence spoke louder than words in the church. Everyone remembered, though none admitted it. Months passed, then years. Margaret aged quickly, her eyes tired, her hair graying faster than it should have. Yet she clung tenderly to what memories she could, pulling Clara's quilts close at night, sometimes reading the few scraps of writing that had not been burned in the fire. She held on to the sound of Clara's voice, repeating softly to herself the last words her daughter had given her. "It's gentle." She clung to those words with desperation, as though they offered her a sliver of mercy, assuring her that Clara had left without pain. Samuel hardened further, though deep within he carried his grief like a stone too heavy to set down. He worked his land year after year, until his body bent under the weight of labor and sorrow both. But he never spoke much of Clara again. When neighbors dared to mention her name, he cut them short with silence. And yet, there were nights Margaret awoke to find him at Clara's empty chair, his rough hands pressed against the fabric of her quilt, his head bowed. He never spoke of those moments, not even when Margaret found him there, but she knew. The silence of his grief weighed differently from hers, quieter, heavier, but equally eternal. Fayette, meanwhile, folded Clara's story into its quiet tapestry of remembered tales. The Holloway girl became the kind of name mentioned in cautious tones, the story retold when frost came early, when a child fell ill, when the church bells tolled too soon. Each retelling shifted slightly. Some recalled her as a child touched by prophecy, others as a girl cursed by lingering shadows. But the core remained. Clara Holloway was the child who had spoken her own death before it came, and in the quiet Missouri evenings, when frost again stretched gently across the fields. Margaret would sometimes stand on her porch, gazing into the silvered earth. She felt her daughter there, not through visions, not through voices, but in the silence, in the stillness that had haunted their home since that winter of 1881. She would whisper her daughter's name into the night, and though no answer came, she felt a presence in the quiet, as though Clara's final whispers still lingered. By the time years had passed, Clara's prophecy had become less a story for Fayette than a lesson carried silently by those who remembered her, a reminder of how fragile life was, how little control one truly had over time, and how children, in their own mysterious ways, sometimes see truths adults refuse to face. Samuel and Margaret lived on, but their lives were marked forever, measured as everything before Clara and everything after. Their grief never ended, only changed with the passing years, just as their love for their daughter never thinned. Generations later, when the Holloway farm had passed to other hands, when even the old church had begun to crumble against the years, the story would still be told, not in sermons or records, but in whispers carried through Fayette, in tales shared by firelight as if the frost itself insisted upon remembrance. Travelers passing through would hear it, shake their heads and move on. But for those who grew among Howard County's fields, Clara Holloway remained more than a child who had lived and died. She was a reminder of something that could not be explained. Something chilling yet deeply human, the certainty of fate spoken through the innocent lips of a child. For Margaret, until her own death, the final words rang in her ears whenever frost touched the window panes. It's gentle. She clung to them as her only comfort. And for Samuel, though he never said it, those same words replayed silently, buried beneath his silence, heavy as the soil he tilled year after year. The frost would come again, as it always did in Missouri. Fields would whitewash, windows would glaze, mornings would bite with sharp air. And when it did, those who remembered would feel it differently, not simply as the season's return, but as the echo of an old, quiet prophecy. Clara Holloway's voice lingered, not in the air, not in the streets, but in the hearts of those who had once heard a child say calmly, "The frost will take me." And in that truth, Fayette carried a tale that would never fade. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.